Hello and welcome to this six-part video series where we will explore the concept of humorous learning cultures. Within this series we will be focusing on why it's important to consider humour and learning, the different perceptions that exist around humour in education, what the literature tells us about humour and learning, what the proposed benefits may be of a humorous learning culture, what the components of a humorous learning culture may look like, and how to develop a humorous learning culture. So the question here is, why humour? Why is it important to focus on the concept of humour within learning and within education? Humour is a fundamental part of our everyday lives and is a shared characteristic of all cultures across the world. We enjoy the playful, humorous interactions that we have with others, and we actively seek humorous stimuli in a variety of forms. Humour can act as a social lubricant and has also been associated with improvements in a number of cognitive functions. However, humour gets very little attention within the education sector. It's rarely mentioned formally in educational policies, and it gets little active, intentional consideration from teachers and school leaders. So I've created this video series to try and encourage other education professionals to think more seriously about the socio-cognitive benefits that humour can provide within a learning environment. I'd like to turn to one of the main reasons why I started to become interested in this link between humour and learning. What do the following people have in common? All of these people share two main characteristics. They are all professional stand-up comedians or comedic actors, and all of them at some point in their life have either worked or trained to be teachers. And this happens to be just a small selection of people that I've found who have experience working as both professional comedians and teachers. And if you consider these 15 people to be not a strong enough link to justify a connection between humour and teaching, here are another 24 examples of ex-teacher comedians. And if you're still not convinced, here's another 24. And if I still haven't got you, there's another 20. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. And it's not just teachers becoming comedians. We also have the reverse happening, where famous comedians use their public comedic platform to educate people about particular topics of interest. Two prominent examples that could be taken from the UK is Stephen Fry, who is generally just a wealth of wisdom on anything that you might want to know about, and Robin Ince, who tries to raise public awareness around the promotion of science and scientific thought. So these links between humour and learning, where we have teachers becoming stand-ups and comedians and comedic actors using that platform to educate people and using humour as a tool and as a medium to achieve that, was the main thing that generated my initial interest in this topic around humour and learning. But it raises a number of questions for me. Why is teaching such a common profession for comedians? Why are the two professions of teaching and being a stand-up comedian so closely linked? How are people that use humour to communicate information more effective in that communication and able to influence and change people's perspectives more effectively? These are the questions I'll be looking to address in my own personal research and across the rest of this video series. A couple of months ago I spoke at an online education conference, and I ran two polls at the start of that session asking these delegates to consider their agreement with two statements around humour and learning. The first poll I took considered the statement, "Humour is important for learning." And I asked the delegates, do they agree or disagree with this statement? I received 193 responses to this. And you can see that the majority of teachers were undecided. However, when you look at the teachers that did decide to consider whether they agreed or disagreed, there was more tendency for teachers to agree rather than disagree that humour was an important part of learning. The second poll I took at this conference was around the statement, "I regularly think about humour within my lessons and school." This is more around teachers considering whether they actively, intentionally, consciously think about humour and the role it plays within their lessons and within their school. There were 186 responses to this poll. You'll see that similarly there are a number of teachers in the middle here that they neither agree or disagree with the statement. But where teachers were then making the decision to consider whether they agree or disagree with this statement, overwhelmingly there are more teachers disagreeing with the statement about them actively thinking about humour within the context of their teaching and learning. So the basic conclusion that can be taken from these two polls is that educators, on the whole, tend to value humour in some way within their learning or within their school. However, educators do not consciously think about humour as part of an important element of their learning and their classroom practice. Let's look at student and teacher perspectives on the use of humour in learning. This is a good place to start. Let's consider what students believe and think and value about the use of humour in learning. Let's also then consider teacher perspectives on their views around the benefits or drawbacks of using humour within learning. Let's start by looking at student perspectives. In 2018, the Times Education Supplement conducted a survey which asked the question, what do primary school students look for in their teachers? This study surveyed around 2,000 students across both public and private sector education. Students were given a number of teacher qualities to rank in hierarchical order, and you can see here the top 10. I've left the number one spot blank for dramatic effect, but when we look at that number one, the answer is funny. Out of all the qualities students considered that they most valued in their teachers, funny was the top answer. And the study explains that it wasn't even close. Funny won by a landslide. But what about secondary school students? Well, the same question was asked, what do secondary school students look for in their teachers? They were given the same activity of ranking a number of qualities they would expect to see in their teacher. And once again, the top spot, funny. And once again, it won by a landslide. So it's clear from this study that students want their teachers to be funny, humorous, and make the lessons enjoyable and engaging. But student perspectives only give us part of the picture. Can we trust that students don't just want an easy lesson that's just fun and enjoyable and not worried about the learning? Or have students intuitively realised that a funny, humorous lesson helps them learn, helps them engage in the lesson, and ultimately helps them progress within their studies? Let's now contrast student perspectives against teacher perspectives. Research has been conducted which explores teachers' views on the use of humour within their education and learning. We find from this research that teachers tend to be more cautious towards humour. Teachers also considered humour not to be a structured classroom activity, something that you cannot intentionally add to lessons. It's more something that evolves and develops naturally within the classroom. Although the views on humour were mixed across this study, they were more negative than positive when evaluating humour as a teaching method. And the majority of teachers believed that it was their responsibility to ensure that humour did not distract students from learning. So rather than it being a positive, important aspect of learning, it's something to be cautious of and not distract students from the learning they're trying to undertake. So we see a difference of opinion between students and teachers. Students are looking for humorous, funny teachers, and they value that within their learning experience, whereas teachers are a bit more cautious around humour and consider humour to be more of a distractive tool and a bit more dubious about the benefits of humour within learning. It therefore makes sense to turn to the literature to explore the use of humour in learning to see where their potential benefits and drawbacks may exist. What does the existing literature tell us about the potential benefits and drawbacks of humour and learning? There is a relatively small but broad body of literature that exists which looks at humour and its role within learning, teaching and education. And within these studies, humour has been associated with a number of aspects of learning, such as productivity, enjoyment, engagement, creativity, divergent thinking, influence, affinity, anxiety, boredom, ideation, recall of information, motivation to learn, problem solving, confidence, attention, social cohesion, memory, comprehension, and some others. The research focusing on the specific aspects of learning do have mixed results. Some suggest positive impacts, others suggest more negative impacts to learning. The areas where we find the most mixed results, where there are both positive and negative aspects, are here highlighted in the orange text. These tend to be more associated with emotional and social aspects of learning, such as engagement, enjoyment, productivity, anxiety, confidence. The aspects of learning that remain in the white text tend to be the areas where we find more clarity and a bit more certainty over the positive impact that humour would have within learning. Research is not entirely positive in these areas, but there's definitely an emphasis towards a beneficial effect of humour within these particular aspects. And you'll see from these that they are less associated with emotional and social aspects of learning. They are more to do with cognitive performance, such as divergent thinking, creativity, problem solving, coming up with new ideas, recalling information, understanding and comprehending information. So where teachers tend to be more cautious of humour and see humour as a double-edged sword where it can be both positive and negative, where humour has the ability to unite a group of people and also divide a group of people depending on how it's used. This is also reflected in the research where we see these social aspects of learning, emotional aspects of learning, being much more temperamental with the positive and negative uses of humour. However, where we see more strength to the use of humour and more justification for the use of humour is around the cognitive performance of students and humour's association with improved problem solving, creativity and other higher level cognitive functions. Does a humorous learning culture enhance learning? It's certainly worth mentioning before looking at humorous learning cultures and the evidence that might support that the majority of research conducted in this area tends to focus more on individualised intervention research. So a teacher doing something funny, or a humorous resource being used, or a group of students or an individual student completing a survey around their own perceptions and views around humour in learning. There is little research focusing on cultural or environmental or group-based aspects of humour and learning, which is where I feel there is a need for further research and exploration. So I feel there's a need to move the research away from humorous interventions to more of a focus around the humorous culture and pulling in a more holistic socio-cultural aspect to humour research and the views around how that can support learning. However, I'd like to summarise two particular pieces of research that were conducted in the 1980s, which do have more of a cultural, atmosphere, environmental aspect to the research, which I think is promising if we're looking to move research into this area. Both of these research studies consider a pre-exposure to humour, so students would have been exposed to a humorous condition prior to completing a task or an activity. This is an important distinction because it isn't the task or activity itself that is humorous, it is the environment or the culture or the atmosphere that students were in prior to completing that task that would influence their performance in that task. The research conducted by Ziv in 1983 asked students to watch blooper videos prior to completing a task which assessed their levels of creativity. So for this experiment, Ziv set up a control group that were not given access to these blooper videos prior to completing the creativity task, and an experimental group which were exposed to blooper videos prior to completing the task. And Ziv found significantly improved results in creativity assessments for those students that had been pre-exposed to a humorous environment. And Ziv followed this up with a second experiment where he didn't pre-expose students to any humorous condition. All he simply did was give them a creativity task with one simple instruction: approach this task in a humorous way. And again, just by asking students to think humorously and interact in a humorous way, improved results occurred for the group that were instructed to think in a more humorous way. The second study to focus on here is Is et al. In 1987, which conducted a similar experiment to Ziv. They had a control group who were not pre-exposed to a humorous condition. They also had an experimental group which were pre-exposed to a humorous condition, again watching humorous videos and blooper videos. However, a third group existed which were an exercise group, and the reason they were included was to see if there was any difference between humour just creating a euphoric experience for students and that elevating their ability to think creatively and solve problems, and see if there was any comparison between the exercise group. And similar results were obtained from this study in that those students that were pre-exposed to humour had improved problem-solving skills when they were assessed in a problem-solving task. And in addition to this, when the humour group were compared to the exercise group, there were still significant improvements beyond what the exercise group were able to achieve in the problem-solving task, thus suggesting that humour has cognitive effects on learning much beyond simply just raising a feeling of euphoria and well-being and happiness within the person conducting that assessment. So these two studies do provide some initial suggestions that a humorous learning culture may support cognitive performance in students. But if we're looking at humorous learning cultures, what exactly does a humorous learning culture look like? What components and features may make up a humorous learning culture? When looking at humorous learning cultures, a good starting point here is: what are the components and key features of a humorous learning culture? In order to explore this question, I'm going to be drawing on three main theories or ideas around learning and humour. The first is play theory, the second is incongruity theory, and the third is benign violation theory. We could consider playfulness to be a key feature of a humorous learning culture. Play is already a feature of many teaching and learning philosophies and learning pedagogies, particularly within early years education, and humour is widely considered to be an extension of play and a feature of playful behaviour. And humour has even been defined as play with cognitive shifts. When being playful, you tend to be more creative, think in a more abstract way, and more hypothetical about how you approach things. And learning through play is really centred around trial and error, testing, experimentation and exploration. So creating opportunities for students to be more playful and acting as a role model in a playful way can definitely support the development of more playful learning culture and in turn generate more humour within the learning culture that exists. And educators need to be more mindful of playful pedagogies, particularly as they move up the age groups towards further education, higher education, where play and playful behaviours often becomes absent from the classroom and the experience for students within that learning environment. For a learning culture to be humorous, it would need to expose students to incongruities. The incongruity theory of humour has been attributed to a number of authors, such as Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, and James Beattie. And the theory suggests that humour is generated through a perceived incongruity and someone's ability to identify and resolve that incongruity. A practical example of this would be someone telling a joke with the setup and the punchline. The setup takes you down one road of expectation and the punchline creates an incongruity to a different destination that you were not expecting. Once you make the connection between the two and understand and comprehend that incongruity and the reasons for it being there, that's where humour is generated. And the practical application of incongruity theory has been demonstrated in neuroscience research, where we've looked at the parts of the brain that are responsible for understanding and appreciating humour are the same parts of the brain responsible for problem solving. So creating a learning culture that exposes students to incongruities Similar in the way that you would get cognitive dissonance around topics, these mismatches of information, where we're challenging prior beliefs and attitudes and understanding. It's a good way to generate a humorous learning culture within a learning environment. The final theory to consider here is benign violation theory. This theory was proposed in 2010 by Peter McGraw and Caleb Warren. It aims to be a more general theory of humour that claims to explain humour across a range of different examples and contexts. And the theory suggests that for humour to be produced, there needs to be three conditions met. The first, a violation needs to occur. The second, the situation needs to be considered benign. And the third, both the violation and the benign situation need to occur simultaneously. This theory is visually represented using this Venn diagram. So this is really an extension of the incongruity theory in that we are looking at creating violations, cognitive dissonance, challenging prior beliefs and attitudes and opinions and understanding around particular topics and themes, but ensuring this is done in a safe, benign, non-threatening way, where students are comfortable to explore these incongruities and violations in a positive way. How can a humorous learning culture be developed? We have some suggestions around what makes up a humorous learning culture, but just creating playful environments where we are exposing students to incongruities and doing that in a benign, safe way doesn't necessarily mean a humorous learning culture will definitely emerge. It provides the environment for that culture to emerge naturally, but it doesn't tease it out in a more productive way. So we're going to look at two things here: application of theory and effective leadership, and how these two things can help to promote and develop a humorous learning culture. Firstly, considering the application of theory, we need to make sure that we are creating playful environments for students where exploration, hypothesis testing and experimentation is encouraged within the learning experience for students. We also need to expose students to a wider range of incongruities where there are mismatches between prior knowledge and beliefs. We are then safely violating those students to think more creatively and openly about particular ideas and topics they may not have considered challenging themselves on before. And this particular application of these theories and concepts will help to create an environment where a humorous learning culture can emerge naturally. But without the effective leadership and policy behind that environment, the humorous learning culture may never develop. So it's about school leadership considering and valuing humour as a valuable part of the learning process, knowing when and how to use humour in the most effective way, and ensuring that humour is not forced and instead comes through in a more natural way. One of the biggest challenges probably for developing a humorous learning culture is to get buy-in from teachers. We know from perspectives on teachers that they are mixed and have mixed views about the potential benefits and drawbacks of using humour in the classroom and as part of their learning experience. So it's important to emphasise where the benefits can be achieved and how to achieve those, to make sure teachers have the knowledge and skills and tools at their disposal to achieve those things. Teachers also have some concern about their ability to be funny. They don't consider themselves funny and feel that if they were to try to be funny when they aren't, the issues that may create and problems that may raise within their learning and teaching classroom environment. But this is where humorous learning culture comes in. We're not asking individual teachers to be funny. We're looking for an environment where teachers and students and leadership of schools and the interaction of all those people and the environment they function in allows for and encourages and values humour as it emerges naturally within that environment. So it's less about being funny, more about seeing funny and seeking humour and contributing to that humorous environment. I hope you enjoyed this video on humorous learning cultures. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bloody like button. Also, any comments are welcome below. My name's Jonathan Sandling. Ta-ta for now.